County. Here to present Senate Bill 1038. A little history. Back in 2006, this legislature passed House Bill 1900, which did away with campaign contribution limits and installed a blackout period where you could not receive contributions while the legislature was in session. When that went up through the court process, that entire paragraph was stricken out as the courts tried to eliminate the blackout period, saying that it had violation of First Amendment rights. When they took that paragraph out, they took the entire section out, also the contribution limits. So what this bill does is go back and try to reinstate what we tried to do in House Bill 1900, which was eliminate contribution limits. We do not address the blackout period. We also say that contributions in excess of $5,000 must be reported electronically within 48 hours, since we're all on electronic reporting right now. A couple other things that, as the bill made it through the Senate, I'll talk about. It states that the treasurer and deputy treasurer of all committees shall reside in the district or county where the committee sits. I think the sponsor of that amendment had intended to draft that for legislative committees, and I think he was overly broad and caught all committees. If you do make any changes, that would be a section that I would change. I don't know that it's the end of the world if you don't change it, but if you start changes, I would look at that. It says legislative and senatorial districts can retain only one address, and that address has to be in the district. And then out-of-state committees that make contributions on issues or candidates have to report the source of those contributions, even if at the time they were not specific to a candidate or a position in the state. It also says the penalty for failing or filing an incomplete report, if you miss a contribution, the penalty is equal to that contribution. People ask, why do you believe this is the right thing to do, and why should we eliminate contribution limits? And I'll give you one example. When I was first elected in the House of Representatives, I was elected in 1990. There was a senatorial race going on in my Senate district, and at that time Sid Johnson was running for election. And that senatorial race, we had no contribution limits, and it cost $100,000. And people said, "Oh my Lord, we will never see another $100,000 senatorial race." We instituted contribution limits in the early 90s, and now an average senatorial race costs $500,000. So clearly the contribution limits have not limited the amount of money going into politics. The problem is it has limited the transparency, as we have found ways through multiple committees to get monies to candidates to get around the contribution limits. And I said before, we could give Colombian drug lords, Missouri politicians could give Colombian drug lords seminars on how to launder money in this state to get it around to this. It is almost impossible to find the root of the money going to support candidates in this case under the scenario we have right now. What I think you'll end up with, by removing the contribution limits, you'll have more transparency, you'll have cleaner campaigns because they'll be controlled by the candidate committee and not so much independent expenditure. And I think people will be able to find out where the money is coming from. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I appreciate you filing the bill. I think it's a good bill. I think that sort of the popular notion is that somehow bad politics is directly related to the size of contribution, as opposed to people's awareness that it's a source of money. People can judge if you take money from a rascal in an election. They can judge you in that election if they know about it, and that's what I like. This immediate notification of large contributions and electronically, and I think it's a fine bill.
Thank you.
I just can't tell you how bad of a bill I think this is.
Okay.
I got folks back home that think that those of us in the legislature, and definitely those in Congress, have lived in a different world. That the ideas that we come up with are so outrageous and so totally bad that there's no way that the sky on our planet is the same as it is in their planet. It's a different color. It must be. And when I look at legislation like this, I think this is probably where they draw those kinds of conclusions. To say that this is a good bill, to say that removing campaign finance limits is a great idea, I think really requires some absence of logic. I understand transparency and why we want to do that, but we could do transparency without moving caps. I can understand some of the other provisions you made, but we could do those without moving caps. So to make it a good bill, you have some good ideas here until we get to the part about the Incumbency Protection Act, as I'll call it here. It's nothing more than another power grab that allows those who are in place, those who are in power, to retain that power. And I talk to lobbyists every day. I know there's a couple of them here as well too. And lobbyists serve a very useful purpose in being experts in their industry and providing us with those expertise. But as special interests, those back home seeing themselves are locked out of the process because they can't write those checks. They can't write a $3.5 check. If they can do it once, they sure can't do it 12 times. And although I would go along with the transparency, I think when you get to let's make this fair, so let's remove limits, I think is just completely outrageous.
Representative, do you have a question?
How can you possibly come before this committee and say this is a good idea?
Well, let me respond to that as somebody who has run both ways, with limits and without limits. And I'll go back to my experience when I first ran for state representative. At the time, there was almost no independent expenditure involved in campaigns. Nobody knew what a political party's function was. The exception was that if a candidate died while in office, it was the political party, the senatorial committee, or the representative committee job to find the replacement to run in a special election. That was the only thing they did. At that time, I would argue that campaigns were cleaner because the ultimate responsibility lied in the candidate committee, and you knew where the money came from. And if you look back, you won't see large contributions in those races back then because people were afraid to take them. For example, in a state rep race, somebody giving you $5,000, if that was out there, that representative is bought and sold by XYZ company, and they didn't take those contributions. So then in the early 90s, we passed contribution limits. And you saw the rise of independent expenditures, organizations that spend thousands or millions of dollars on behalf of candidates. You don't know who they are. We also told the candidate, oh, by the way, you can't have any contact with them. So if they're out there running negative ads against your opponent, you can't tell them to start, stop, or do anything like that. You can't have any contact with them. Then we saw the rise of the political party committees that became mechanisms for funneling money to candidates because they can do it at 10 times the rate. Recently, we saw one organization form 100 different PACs solely for the purpose of getting around our contribution limits to get to that. What I think people want, if they think politicians are bought and sold, at least they want to know who they're bought and sold by. And I believe that is the crux of the problem. And you may disagree with that.
Unbelievably.
But I will tell you, as somebody who has run on both systems, the old system was better, and it was cleaner.
Senator, I used to go out and I was a bit of a young political activist, I guess, and I would go out and put those signs up in the yards, and I would, put the big 4x8s up and knock on all the doors and all that stuff. But I was a young guy. I used to wear the white tube socks, and I got a little older now. I started wearing dress socks, and campaigns cost a whole lot more. So it seems like if we go back to the white socks, things cost a lot cheaper back then. That was the best.
Did it cost more with or without contribution limits? When I ran for state rep, I spent $25,000 to win that race. I would argue this time around, my same seat will spend $125,000, and that's with contribution limits.
Was to demonstrate the bizarre. To say that is a result of campaign limits and not an industry that has developed and become extremely technical over the years and campaign elections and PR and the things they're able to do today, as opposed, I still remember back when we did things, remember the little 3x5
Actually,
card box,
What I'm saying is people believe that contribution limits keep the money out of politics. And what I argue is they keep the transparency out of politics.